If he dies, he dies.
He dies.
Today, we got such a great response to our last Privateer Press video. Inevitably, we're shills, so we want to make another video that gets a lot of views. More
clicks.
You know what? And actually, we got some great dialogue between people that watch the video and the content. And a lot of people brought up a lot of interesting things. And quite frankly, we have still a lot of things to say about it too. We kind of talked about more of one angle of it.
Yeah. No, the the consumers or players of Warmachine, etc. They had much more constructive comments than the Games Workshop guys.
Yeah, it's kind of funny.
It wasn't just on fire burning.
I wonder if it's because they've had time to process.
Yeah,
and a lot of the kind of emotion has kind of left.
Yes,
left it because it's been years, right?
Yes,
since the real true denouement of the whole situation, and now people are kind of just left with oh, this is what actually just happened, and I can put my feelings aside.
Yeah.
But I wanted to talk today about something that I didn't really get a chance to talk about last week because we try not to ramble for too long. Because people don't watch the ends of the videos a lot of time. That's what the analytics say. So
that's when I say the really spicy things.
That's right. Yes. About the concept of in our economy that we have today, but also in the miniature world of this concept of growing or dying, and sort of this sort of dangerous game these companies play, where they fight for market share with the big whale that is Games Workshop. And Asmodee to some extent. They're splashing their big money around and trying to find their place in the market. And Warmachine's a great example of probably the only other game that has flown near the sun in the last 20 years, really.
In terms of how much they penetrated the shelf space.
Which I think is honestly people. We were talking about X-Wing and stuff in our market update last week. I think it's the only real true metric of something is how much shelf space is given to a product, right?
Yeah, I mean, maybe ultimately, if you take all the atomic mass offerings and put them together, maybe even then, the Warmachine wall in some stores would be as big as the 40K wall.
Yeah, I remember seeing it
one to one.
Yeah, it was pretty impressive. And this concept of they reached this point essentially where they were growing so well, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about essentially what their options actually could have been at that point and how they handled it, and talk a little bit about how they were running their business, and why that particular mode of running your business has its limits essentially. So maybe you can explain a little bit how the distribution system works and how the Warmachine ultimately was.
Chris loves giving me these little thing that's actually this big and squeeze it into a little box.
Yeah, do it in 30 seconds.
30 seconds. This is my video. I can talk as long as I want. No, but yeah, so essentially most miniature games and hobby products, they have basically two ways. They can either sell directly to their consumers. In the case of hobby stores, they can sell directly to us, or they can pick a distributor and sell through them. So both have pros and cons. Obviously, if you sell to a distributor, you're kind of saying, I just want to make the thing.
Yeah. I
don't want to have anything to do with really selling it. I'm just going to make it, and we're going to sell them to distributors. And the beauty there is once the distributor buys a quantity, some pallets of quantity off you, you've made your money. So whether the product then does well in the hobby store, it will affect you eventually, but it's kind of once it's out in the wild, life is good and you can move on. Obviously, the profit margins are worse there because you are selling it at a lower price.
You go to the middleman first, right?
Yeah. So, and that's very common if you're a smaller company because you maybe don't have the extra funds to pay salespeople, and then have your own warehouse and packing and all of that stuff that goes along with it.
It's kind of where you end up if they're a middle-sized company, right? That's kind of the goal. Because if you're really small, you're probably still trying to sell direct to customers.
Obviously some things. I think miniature companies are interesting because if you're a board game company or a card game company, you're fine with distribution because you're it's all about just selling lots of volume. You're just a little factory or wherever you get it made. You want to get it made and just out the door. You don't want to be the one having to pack it because it's all packed nicely and whatever. With the miniatures, there's a lot more going on. There's like a lot of more accessories. There's a lot more extra like rule sets and card packs and even the hobby bits. You got to get into the right stores. It's a little more tricky. So the flip side is the direct sales model, which most I don't know. Again, there's some small companies that do it, but it's usually the bigger companies do it because again, they have the resources. Obviously, like we've explained before, with Games Workshop, for example, there's a guy we talk to every week. We've had this guy for 10 years. So there's relationships. He personally handles our issues, and his job is to also sell us things, tell us what's coming, explain why products are good or not good or whatever. Well,
yeah, and ultimately he has the company's sort of explanations for what's going on and why it's happening, essentially, right?
No,
which is true. Which gives you a proper insight.
Sometimes
right?
you could argue, sometimes I'm sure some of the videos would be like, or commenters would be like, they're just giving you their propaganda. And I'm like, well, sometimes they have answers that I didn't think about, and be like, well, we do it like this for this reason. And that can give you some, I don't know, some comfort, I guess. But more importantly, it gives us someone to yell at, which is not common. If a smaller company that makes something annoying or bungles something badly, we have no recourse. I'm going to yell at my distributor sales rep. Like, he doesn't know. He's just he's selling 10,000 items to 10,000 clients. Like, he doesn't.
And I think ultimately the interesting sort of distinction I think I see is that if your company primarily uses the distribution model, your only agency and way you can communicate with your customers is essentially through your own marketing department.
Yeah.
But that conversation is always sort of direct to customer. It does sort of bypass what I think is truly unique about hobby games, which is the retail store.
Yeah.
And there's no real direct communication link to this. And,
No.
and ultimately this is what we'll get into in the video, is I think was the one of the major factors in privateer press's downfall.
Sure. Yeah. They didn't have. I know some of the commenters brought up, and I completely forgot about this. And I know there was a big problem when problems started heavily occurring in 3.0, and they turned off their forums, and their only way, because it was just getting, they completely lost control of that vehicle at that point.
Right.
Where again, that's an important point. We see that even now. Recently, Atomic Mass had some sort of delay. I think some of the X-Men arrived here in Canada. Professor X was super late, months late or something. And there's no answer. Customers are just annoyed. They're like, Atomic Mass is garbage. They can't get this thing out. Why? How come it's already out here and there, and there's no explanation for the delay? The distributor doesn't have an answer for me. Whereas, at least on the Games Workshop end, they usually have some. They'll just tell me flat out, hey, we didn't get this. This is something we had to remake something because it was broken, and you're just like. Okay.
And there's usually a reassurance attached to that of it's coming at this time, or it will come, and I think that just kind of calms everybody down.
Yeah,
it's a very proactive sort of approach, right, as opposed to a reactive approach.
Yeah. So. Yeah. So anyway, so that's the there's a big difference there. So without having, I guess to Chris's opening point is because Privateer Press didn't have a relationship with local stores directly.
Yeah.
They didn't. They weren't able to talk to us, and then they also didn't really have a great plan, and maybe it's because the company was growing rather quickly, and they just kind of felt hey, we're the kings of the world right now, and so there was no really okay, what happens now? You really need to every stage of the growth needs to has its own problems that occur, and then
absolutely, and I would argue too that the critical points that people always point to with Warmachine, the edition changes where things start to fall apart. That's the point at which we probably get the most communication with our trade departments.
Yeah.
When there's a new edition of something coming out, because the companies understand how vital that transition is for the customer base, and they're trying to basically arm you with as much information about how to sell it, what to tell your customers ahead of time, so that you're ready for when those people come in your shop. You can have a legitimate conversation with them about what's going on, and not having that set up before Mark III came out. Here's our plan for Mark III. These are the products we think you should carry and why. This is what it's going to look like, and maybe why it's not going to be finished. You know, because like in a lot of ways, like Mark III was a lot like what Games Workshop's done with the sort of data card like but like for Games Workshop did it with 10th and largely people were pretty content despite there being like massive imbalances and stuff like that.
Yeah.
The same thing happened with Privateer, but people's expectations of what they were expecting versus what was delivered, I think, really ultimately was the downfall there. And part of setting expectations is that I think that vital communication link in the chain, which they were completely lacking, which is like that conversation with hobby stores and people that are ultimately making the decisions to carry their products.
Yeah, it's the ability to give you that information where you, critically, that little bit where you go, where customers come in and they're like, oh, I don't like this change, and you can say yes, but don't worry, this is free or this will be addressed, etc. And that goes a long way because that happens all the time here, basically every summer, because there's a new edition with Games Workshop every other year or whatever, based on the rotation they're doing. So you always have that, like, well, what's changing?
Yeah.
And what about my current army? And what's happening to that? And okay. And if you can checklist through all those like major concerns, or at least give answers to like when the thing will be addressed, people are usually like, oh, okay, or they'll either say, okay, I'll wait, or they'll say, okay, that sounds good, I'm ready to go. So then continuing on, part of not having a plan, and lack of communication is now, when there were some problems with Mark III, etc., then you had people, like, I saw a lot of comments from last week's video about the they ruined my army, or my broadcaster doesn't do what he did before, so now my entire build is useless, all these things. Yeah. And on one hand, that is part of additions and game changes. That's oddly a feature that they change things around, right? They want you to go and buy a new Warcaster and a new thing, but again, I think a part of that is not having the outlining what the plan was to go along, and maybe if they did that better, maybe you would have been like, oh, okay, it's not so bad, I can just maybe try a different guy, or maybe there's a build that is similar. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right, and I think that as much as that dialogue has to happen between the company and the customer, ultimately, like, if we're not included in that dialogue, we ultimately just shift into like the customer section essentially, and then we have nothing different to say, right? So when a customer comes in, they're like, I'm upset about this, and you're like, yeah, me too, I guess. Like, I don't know. That seems bad, and I don't know. Yeah, I can give my context in terms of like trying to put it in the place of all the other things that have happened, but yeah, I don't know. It just kind of puts you in that situation.
It does.
Yeah. So I think like it is a cautionary tale, to use that word again, of like you can, I think, like we'll probably do a market update for Corvus Belli soon because people have been asking for it. Staying small and staying to a certain size doesn't put you into these vulnerabilities, I don't think, because generally what you see with these like smaller games is like people seem to it's not a cult mentality, but like people are way more protective of their games when they're smaller, because they understand how like delicate their player base is and how much their passion means to the company. But as things get bigger and sort of to transcend those sizes, that's when you sort of open yourself up to, I think, all those vulnerabilities.
Yeah, I mean, to be really blunt and honest, is when you get a certain size and you make a change, you have to factor into your calculus that you're going to attrition a chunk of people.
Right.
But it's supposed to be offset by the fact that you're going to gain new people. And again, we've said this like ad nauseum, that like that is part of the business cycle. Like
100%, yeah.
And you take the emotion out of it, because let's be honest, when it comes to business emotion, it's just like, just up here, it's a nice to have, but it doesn't. Yeah, so they so they didn't really think about that. They just kind of were like, well, I don't even remember. See, maybe the commenters will know better. Like, at what point was the Mark III thing? Because again, they were so, Mark II was so, they were so like, this is great.
This is the best. We don't ever need to make another edition ever again. So I was setting some pretty poor expectations.
Yeah, right.
Future,
so then they also said, we're not going to. So there must have been a moment where the money and the sales were like,
and that's it, right? Where they realized, and this is kind of part of the commentary, where it's like they realized, I was like 7 or 8 years into Mark II. They're like, we need to make a 3rd edition if we want to actually generate some sales here. And then they made it so quickly that it wasn't like a finished full product.
And they didn't have a plan for the people they were going to annoy, which was going to happen.
Instead of, and like I said, if I get a trade call from Jeff from Privateer Press, 2 months before the release of Mark III, and he's like, look, this is where we're at as a company. We need to make some new customers, and that's why we're making Mark III.
So yeah.
That I would love to hear something like that.
Yes.
Because they're identifying.
And here are products that are going to help you with that. Yeah. So I'll give you some more like small examples of like how, again, people, Fanboy GW, obviously, shill one here.
Big time.
Going on about, so obviously,
can't be trusted.
Obviously, Games Workshop's been through this cycle a lot. They perfected it.
Yeah.
You could argue. They have literal mechanisms that say, and there's a reason why new editions come out in like June, July. They have, because their year end is in end of April. So they want this. So editions arrive in their Q1. Now, more importantly, though, they literally will say, "Hey, there's a new edition coming. You all know about it. We've been teasing it, showing it off.
Yep.
Here is they give so trade accounts are good standing like ours or whatever. You will get a what do you want to call it a reimbursement. It's not a reimbursement. It's like a credit.
A credit, yeah.
So that you can take all your old books, which are going to be invalid in like a short time, and basically get some credit for those.
Yeah.
And like that is like it's such a small gesture, but it is so important because it makes sure that like stores, whatever size they are, whatever like amount of inventory they have of old books and cards, aren't stuck with them as like a complete dead weight. And the company's factored in that
into their prices, right? Quite frankly, and it's a promise, right? That's what it really ultimately is.
And it means that I can then take the books off ahead of time and not piss off customers that are like just buy a book and then they're like, oh, it's invalid, and that's like it sounds small and meager, but it really does.
But yeah, and
it shows
when
how
you
professional
think about it in privateer terms, if you had committed to a huge 2nd edition wall of product and you had all those books. Obviously the models are still fine, I imagine.
Sure.
But all those books, and you're just looking at it, you're like, oh, there's like $600 to $800 of money I'll never get back.
Never, yeah.
And it just like, as a small business owner, nobody gets into the hobby business to make $1 million.
No.
Those are things you remember. They stick with you, right? And ultimately, like, if that happens a couple times, that's all it takes for like someone to shift into the bargain bin, and you see you later,
Yeah, and actually, because this always happens, because things come to our mind later in the video when no one's watching. So kind of redoubling down on the lack of communication. So the other thing that occurs is, and also the lack of planning is, and a little bit of this is tied to going through distribution, is they didn't really establish. And I think this is a big mistake, a proper map or minimum advertised price or some sort of guardrails to keep the product from falling into the like spiral of going being sold at the cheapest price or race to the bottom. And I think that really hurt them as well, because now the product devalued significantly. And so you just like, even stores are like, but I bought it at this cost and it's now worth less than that, So then that helped accelerate, because it was a rapid rise and a rapid crash. Like it wasn't like a slow, thing. And I've seen other miniature games hang around because they have some mechanisms there that it's not a race to the bottom. Because stores will still say, well, I have this much on the shelf. This is still worth X on the secondary market, so there's no reason to just like dump it or whatever.
Yeah,
so,
for sure.
So I think that hurt as well. Like, and then once it also reaches that point, distributors just start like scaling back their orders because they're just like, no one's buying it and it's worthless and we can't even get rid of it. It just starts to,
the system chokes right on itself or whatever. And now you end up with a company that's like 1/100th of its size and
just pittering away.
Barely existing essentially. Like, I mean, that's the reality of it.
I'm always impressed when someone names one of their products. I'm like, what? Oh, that company.
It's such a huge change. It's crazy. It's crazy.
It is.
And I mean, like, for those of you, like, I don't really want to talk too much about the privateer press stores or whatever, like the potential of that never came to be. But that was it's always a good measure in my mind of like the fact that they never even really tried to open 1 or 2 stores. Kind of just shows you that they they never really wanted to compete with Games Workshop or knew how to. Because fundamentally, they didn't understand why Games Workshop was what they were.
No, I do, again, without knowing the full story. Like, I think some of the commenters, you know, this will eventually, you know, some of those guys maybe that were there in the beginning will tell their stories. Like, really enjoying some of the old GW guard that are doing the podcast circuit and telling some cool stories. I would love to hear some more of the true of the thing. But I can only assume that it was the case of just the like rapid stardom followed by just no plan.
I think you're right, man.
Yeah.
Like, honestly, it does feel like it's like, oh, I mean, what the guy's name was, like Matt or something. The guy who owns the company. Forget his full name, but
a lot of people bring up
the fact that, like, you know, he's just a guy and like ultimately he's making these choices or whatever, and it's just like all this money's coming in, and I guess sometimes it feels like when that's happening, and we can relate to this, like when things are good, you kind of just, it starts to feel like maybe this is sustainable or whatever.
Yeah, sure.
And the decisions you make though when things are going well. I remember an old saying, like an old boss told me. He's like, when in good times, that's when you need to be the most cynical.
Yeah.
And in bad times, it's when you need to be the most positive. And it's actually the opposite of how you want to feel in those situations. Which ultimately, when Warmachine was like, you can look back at Games Workshop's history, and this will maybe be an interesting video to do. When things were great, what did they do? They invested in the future. Lord of the Rings. They took all that Lord of the Rings money and put it all back into their business and invested into more miniature making, into new technologies, into staff. Yeah. What did Warmachine do? They just made the money and then thought they could make more money, right? Like, ultimately,
the owner pocketed more dividends. Probably. I don't know.
They made models the same way. They they got into plastics too late.
Maybe we'll get into a video on game owners, like night models.
Oh, not again.
Not again.
Yeah, I feel like I've lived that rant, like, but not in like video form. But yeah, there's some good like Malifaux night models. Like, I got some doozies lined up for the future for sure.
Stay tuned.
Yeah.
Stay tuned.
Well, we hope you enjoyed that video. If you like these kind of videos and you're still watching to this point, we do a couple of these a week. You can support us on Patreon, which we really appreciate. It helps us reinvest back into doing this. And it also says, hey, maybe we should make more of these because it actually generates a little bit of money.
Yeah.
And it takes, like, to be honest, it takes us away from doing our actual job, which feeds our families, right? So it has to make sense to some degree. But give us a like and a subscribe, and thanks for watching.
Thanks.
Take care.
Bye.